Watching a video on YouTube concerning the disassembly and lubrication of the M417, I thought I'd give it a shot. The trigger pull on my rifle from the factory was kind of rough, so I thought I'd take a look at the available components and see what kind of alterations, if any, I could make to them. I'm not going to go through the whole disassembly. There's a great video on YouTube that details that. It's by Maccabee Speed. You can check that out for disassembly. Once disassembled, you're left with 5 major components: trigger return spring, trigger return bar, the trigger, the sear safety spring, and the sear itself. Checking out these components as they were in the receiver, I cycled the action a few times and discovered that the sear face engaged the striker or hammer. I'm not quite sure what Crossman is calling that particular part, and I thought that with some minor stoning and buffing, we could make the trigger pull overall smoother and cleaner. One of the biggest detriments to a good trigger pull is friction between contacting metal surfaces along with spring tension. Looking at the contact area of the sear that engages the striker, I found on mine it was neither smooth nor square. So the first thing I did was to stone this area flat and then polish it. To stone it, I used a Easy Lap diamond hone and stone. You have to remember that when you remove metal, you can't put it back, so this has to be done very carefully. All you want to do is flatten that surface. When you go and polish it, you're going to remove metal too, so again, just be careful. You want a square, flat surface that you can polish out later on. The other area I took care of while polishing the contact area here is this radius, which fits in and engages the trigger. This was actually activates the sear and releases the striker. So while I had the polishing tool out, I went ahead and polished this area too. You want to go ahead and polish these areas just enough to remove any stone marks from that contact surface. Again, like I mentioned, the polishing will remove metal too, so just be careful. You want this flat and polished. When polishing these areas, I used a Dremel tool with a small hard buffing wheel and Dremel polishing compound. I usually put a couple of drops on the dry polishing pad before applying the compound because it helps to absorb helps the pad to absorb the polishing compound. Also, it reduces heat while polishing. And again, you want to just polish these surfaces to remove any stoning marks. And like I said before, this area here, radius, it actually contacts the trigger and releases the sear. The next area I worked on was the hammer return spring. Normally, the long portion of this leg is straight. What I've done, since this is a tension spring, there's not too much you could do. So I took and I bent the end of the long portion of the return spring, which reduces some of the tension. I've bent this so that when it lays back into the receiver, this portion is flat against the bottom of the receiver. It did reduce it a hair. I could have bent it more, but I didn't want to overdo it because I didn't want to have to try to straighten this thing back out again. Lastly, I took in, while I had the polishing tool out, went ahead and polished the front and back surfaces on the trigger return bar. I'm not quite sure what this engages. I don't have a parts diagram, so I have no idea what this does. I know it sits behind the gas tube or compression tube. I figured it has to contact something somewhere back there, so I went ahead and I polished both sides of this. After you're done making your modifications, go ahead and remove any polishing residue from your parts, lube them up, and reassemble. Before replacing all the screws in the side cover, go ahead and put the side cover back in place. Keep a little pressure on the side cover, cock the hammer, and make sure everything's working properly. And that's it, you're finished. You'll find that you'll have a cleaner, crisper release on the sear, better trigger pull. Unfortunately, the length of pull, the distance that the trigger travels at this point, I haven't come up with anything to correct that, but maybe sometime in the future I'll figure something out to shorten the length of the trigger pull.